So you have your Part 107, or you're thinking about getting it, and you want to know exactly what rules and regulations apply to you. Now, the FAA does provide a summary sheet, but it usually leaves readers with more questions than it does answers. So here in this video, I'm going to go over and explain most of the major rules and regulations. Now, of course, with legislation like this, there are infinite possibilities of what you can and cannot do. That being said, I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. However, if you do have any more questions that are not answered in this video, go ahead and leave them in the comments below and I'll try to get back to you. Now, unlike hobbyist rules, there's only one rule set that you have to follow and they're pretty clearly laid out. I've broken them up into 3 different sections: operations limitations, airspace requirements, and personnel requirements. First and foremost, I have to explain the idea of having a pilot in command before some of these rules even make any sense. Now, having a pilot in command means that the person with a Part 107 in your operation doesn't necessarily have to be the one directly controlling the drone, but they do, however, have to be close enough to take control if something does go wrong. You'll see in a second why this becomes important for multiple other rules. First, operational limitations. Number 1 is that your aircraft must weigh under 55 pounds, and number 2 is going to be that it must have a maximum ground speed of 100 miles an hour. Number 3 is that you must fly with a maximum altitude of 400 feet AGL or above ground level, or if you're around a structure, within 400 feet of that structure. Now yes, that does mean that if there's a building that is 400 feet high, then you can technically fly 800 feet AGL as long as you are right above that building and within 400 feet of that building. Now what this allows people to do is be able to get nice shots of buildings or structures that they need to get close to but maybe be above 400 feet AGL. Number 4 is that your operations are daytime only operations. However, you can also operate during civil twilight. Now this is 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after sunrise and sunset accordingly. And it does specify that you have to have appropriate anti-collision lights, although what that means may be a little iffy. Number 5, and this is a big one, is that you must maintain visual line of sight with your aircraft. This is also known as VLOS. Now either the pilot in command or a visual observer can maintain this VLOS, but somebody has to have their eyes on the drone at all times. Now I'll explain what a visual observer is in just a second, but it does create some interesting circumstances. And number 6 is that the minimum weather visibility must be 3 miles from wherever your control station is. Number 7 is no operations from a moving aircraft and no operations from a moving vehicle unless you're in an area that is sparsely populated. Now I don't believe sparsely populated is actually defined anywhere, so we're pretty much up to our own definition when it comes to that. Just be smart. Number 8 is no careless or reckless operations. And number 9 is no carrying hazardous materials. Number 10 is that you must yield your right-of-way to other aircraft. Number 11 is that you must perform a pre-flight checklist before every flight. Now this is completely up to the pilot or the PIC or the Part 107 holder to come up with whatever this pre-flight checklist is, but you do have to have one and you have to follow it. Now the last thing I'm going to mention is that there are rules for transporting things with your drone. I don't really have time to go over all of that right now, and I feel like it's outside of the scope of this video for most people. If you are interested in transporting things with your drone, I will provide some documentation below. It'll be clearly marked. Next up is airspace requirements. Now this whole section is predicated that you have knowledge of the different airspaces and what they mean and how to find what they are. Essentially, you can fly in any Class G airspace without doing anything at all. You're allowed to fly there no matter what at all times. If you're going to fly in any other class airspace that is controlled in any way, you're going to have to get an authorization for that airspace. Now the recommended way of going about getting these authorizations is through the FAA portal linked right here and in the description below. However, this can be really slow. I've heard of many months to get these authorizations. Now the FAA is promising to be faster and faster at this, but at this time it's still very slow and that can cause some problems, especially if you're on time crunch. Now there is another option, even though it's not really recommended. You can call the tower that is in control of that airspace and ask them directly for an authorization. And they are allowed to give you that authorization. However, most of them, especially if it's a medium to large size airport, either won't even take your call or direct you to the FAA portal regardless. But it is worth a try. Now again, reading sectional charts is outside of the scope of this video, but I highly suggest that you learn how to read them proficiently and pretty quickly, because relying on something like AirMap is really not an option when you're doing Part 107 operations. It's just not accurate enough and it doesn't give you a good enough idea of what the airspace really is for you to make a call on what the airspace is. Besides, sectional charts are by far the most accurate way of figuring it out. Now besides airspace classes, you are going to have to watch out for things like TFRs just like you would if you were a hobbyist. Now it's up to you on how to find these, but a really good way is to go to a site like iFlightPlanner and look and see if there's any active warnings in your area. Lastly, personnel requirements. Number 1 is that you may use a Vhual Observer. Now, I mentioned Vhual Observer just a few minutes ago, but I'm going to explain it a little bit further. Now, any Vhual Observer is just someone that's on your crew that helps you see and avoid things in regards to your aircraft. Now, interestingly enough, this Vhual Observer can fulfill the VLOS requirement that I mentioned earlier, meaning that you or the pilot can have their eyes on something else or not even be able to see the aircraft at all, as long as your Vhual Observer does have VLOS in the aircraft and can clearly communicate with you. This has some really interesting consequences, as it makes FPV flying legal, as the person who's actually flying the drone can have their goggles on, meanwhile their Vhual Observer has VLOS with the drone, and again, as long as they're within shouting distance of them or have clear communication with them. Now, this is really interesting because this is not technically legal with hobbyists, but it is legal under Part 107. Number 2 is that no pilot in command or Vhual Observer can serve for more than one aircraft. Number 3 is that you may not operate your small unmanned aircraft over anybody who's not directly part of the operations, who's not under a covered structure, or who's not in an enclosed vehicle. Now, people have tried to stretch this definition, saying that anyone around them is technically part of their operations and therefore they're allowed to fly over them. People say that if you go to an event and the crowd that you're filming, technically they're part of your operations so that you can fly over them. That's not valid and you can't do that. The only way to actually be exempt from this rule is to be granted a waiver from this one rule. I've even seen people go as far as to suggest drawing a line around a field and having some posters saying that if you go within this line, then you're part of my operations. It's again, not valid at all. Now, of course, I couldn't cover every single thing in the legislation because it is quite lengthy. However, this will cover most of you in almost every circumstance. However, if you are in an interesting situation, please leave it in the comments below and I'll try to get back to you. I just couldn't mention every single thing in a video that's of normal length. If you're a hobbyist and don't have your Part 107 yet, or if you are a Part 107 certificate holder but still want a refresher on the hobbyist rules when you're flying on the weekends, go ahead and check out my hobbyist video so you know exactly what you're doing. Now, and that finishes up this Part 107 rules video. Comments are always greatly appreciated as feedback on how I'm doing in these videos, and again, questions are definitely welcome. Fly safe and see you next time.